The morning rain had turned the military academy training grounds into a muddy mess. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat and dirt from her forehead as she completed her 5th lap around the obstacle course. Her civilian clothes were soaked through, clinging to her small frame as she navigated between the wooden barriers and rope climbs that dotted the field. She had arrived at Riverside Military Academy 3 days ago, not as a cadet but as a new physical training instructor. The position was supposed to start Monday, but Sarah wanted to familiarize herself with the facilities over the weekend. She had always been the type to prepare thoroughly for everything in her life. The academy was prestigious, known for producing some of the finest military officers in the country. The campus sprawled across 200 acres of pristine Virginia countryside, with brick buildings that spoke of tradition and discipline. Sarah had been excited about this opportunity to shape young minds and bodies, to pass on some of the skills and values she had learned during her own military service. As she approached the final obstacle, a 12-foot wall climb, Sarah noticed a group of cadets emerging from the nearby dormitory building. They were dressed in their crisp weekend uniforms, talking loudly among themselves as they headed toward the dining hall for breakfast. Sarah glanced at her watch. It was barely 7 in the morning, but military school started early. The cadets spotted her immediately. There were 6 of them, all male, probably in their senior year based on their confident swagger and the way they carried themselves. Sarah could hear their voices getting louder as they approached the training area. "Look at this," one of them called out, his voice dripping with amusement. "Someone's lost." Sarah ignored them and focused on her climb. She had dealt with difficult people throughout her military career, and a few teenage cadets weren't going to ruin her morning workout. She gripped the rope and began pulling herself up the wall with practiced efficiency. "Hey, lady," another cadet shouted. "This is a restricted area. You're not supposed to be here." Sarah reached the top of the wall and looked down at them. The lead cadet was tall and broad-shouldered, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expression that suggested he was used to being in charge. His name tag read Thompson, and he wore the insignia of a cadet captain. "I'm aware of where I am," Sarah replied calmly, preparing to rappel down the other side. Thompson laughed and turned to his friends. "Did you hear that? She's aware." The other cadets joined in the laughter, their voices echoing across the empty training ground. Sarah completed her descent and began jogging toward the next section of the course. She had planned to do one more complete circuit before heading back to her temporary quarters to shower and prepare for her meeting with the academy's commandant later that morning. But the cadets weren't finished with her. They followed along the perimeter of the course, their voices growing more mocking with each step. "Ma'am, you really need to leave," Thompson called out in an exaggerated, polite tone. "This equipment is for trained military personnel only. Someone like you could get seriously hurt." Sarah continued running, her breathing steady despite the challenging pace she had maintained for the past hour. She had run much longer distances in much worse conditions during her military service. A few miles on a training course in Virginia was nothing compared to the desert marathons she had completed in Iraq and Afghanistan. "Maybe she's deaf," suggested another cadet, a shorter boy with dark hair whose name tag read Williams. "Or maybe she just doesn't understand English very well." The comment hit a nerve. Sarah's parents had immigrated from Mexico when she was young, and she had faced similar assumptions throughout her life. People often underestimated her based on her appearance or made assumptions about her background, but she had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. As she approached the monkey bars, one of the cadets jogged ahead and positioned himself directly in her path. This was Rodriguez, according to his name tag, and he was grinning as if this was the most entertaining thing he had done all week. "Excuse me?" Sarah said firmly, stopping just short of where he stood. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Rodriguez said, his voice mock serious. "This is Riverside Military Academy. We train future military officers here. This isn't a public gym where civilians can just wander around playing soldier." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "I need to get through." Thompson had caught up now, and he stepped up beside Rodriguez. "Look, I don't know how you got onto campus, but you need to leave immediately. Security doesn't patrol this area on weekends, but that doesn't mean you can just trespass wherever you want." The other cadets formed a loose semicircle around Sarah. She was outnumbered 6-1, but she had been in worse situations. Much worse. Still, she preferred to handle this diplomatically if possible. "I have permission to be here," she said simply. Williams snorted. Permission? From who? Did you fill out a tourist form at the visitor center? Yeah, right, added another cadet. What's next? Are you going to tell us you're in the military too? The laughter that followed was loud and harsh. Sarah looked at their faces, young, privileged, completely certain of their own superiority. They reminded her of some of the officers she had encountered early in her career. Men who assumed that being born into the right family or attending the right schools automatically made them better soldiers than someone like her. As a matter of fact, Sarah said quietly, I am military. This only made them laugh harder. Thompson was nearly doubled over and he had to wipe tears from his eyes before he could speak again. Oh, this is rich, he gasped. Let me guess, you're a Navy SEAL, right? Or maybe Delta Force. He looked around at his friends for approval of his wit. Sarah didn't respond. She had learned that there were times when words were useless, when people had to see the truth for themselves. These cadets had already made up their minds about who she was and what she was capable of. Nothing she could say would change their opinions. Rodriguez stepped closer, his expression growing more aggressive. Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, but this needs to stop right now. You're embarrassing yourself. Yeah, Williams chimed in. Why don't you go back to whatever yoga studio you crawled out of and leave the real military training to people who actually belong here? Sarah took a deep breath and looked each of them in the eye. She could see the absolute certainty in their faces, the complete conviction that they knew exactly who she was and what she represented. In a few hours, when she met with their commandant and began her new job, their whole world was going to be turned upside down. But for now, she just needed to get through her workout. The situation was escalating quickly. Sarah could see it in the way the cadets were positioning themselves, in the increasing aggression in their voices. Thompson had stepped forward again, his chest puffed out in a display of dominance that would have been comical if it wasn't so potentially dangerous. I think you misunderstood me, Thompson said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. This isn't a request. You need to leave now. Sarah remained calm, her hands loose at her sides. She had been trained to read body language, to recognize the signs of impending violence. These boys were working themselves up to something, feeding off each other's energy and bravado. She had seen it before in young soldiers who thought they had something to prove. I'm not looking for trouble, Sarah said evenly. I just want to finish my workout. Your workout? Williams laughed harshly. Lady, this isn't a Planet Fitness. This is serious military equipment. You probably don't even know how to use half of this stuff properly. Rodriguez was circling around behind her now, trying to flank her position. Sarah noted his movement without turning her head. She was aware of all 6 cadets, their positions, their likely next moves. It was second nature to her, this constant tactical assessment of her surroundings. Look, said another cadet who hadn't spoken much, a thin boy whose name tag read Chen. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't you just tell us your name and who gave you permission to be here, and we can sort this whole thing out. It was meant to sound reasonable, but Sarah could hear the condescension underneath. Chen was playing the role of the reasonable one, the good cop to Thompson's bad cop. She had seen this routine before, too. My name is Sarah Martinez, she said simply. Thompson's eyes lit up with cruel amusement. Martinez? Well, that explains a lot. Let me guess. You're here looking for work in the kitchen? Or maybe housekeeping? The racist comment hung in the air like a physical slap. Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest. But she had learned long ago to channel that energy productively. Some of the most valuable lessons in her life had come from people who underestimated her, because of her name or her appearance. That's enough, she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that made several of the cadets take an involuntary step back. But Thompson was too worked up to notice the change in her tone. He was playing to his audience now, showing off for his friends who were hanging on his every word. No, seriously, he continued, his voice getting louder. I bet that's exactly what this is. You probably saw all the military equipment and thought you could take some photos to show your friends. Maybe post them on social media and pretend you're some kind of badass. Williams jumped in eagerly. Yeah, that's totally it. She's probably going to post pictures of herself on the obstacle course with some caption about being a warrior princess or something. The laughter was getting meaner now, more personal. Sarah could see that they were feeding off each other's cruelty, each one trying to top the last comment. It reminded her of pack behavior she had observed in combat zones, the way insecurity and fear could manifest as aggression when people felt their status was threatened. Rodriguez had completed his flanking maneuver and was now directly behind her. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice close to her ear. "I think someone needs to teach this lady some respect." Sarah turned slowly to face him. Rodriguez was bigger than her by at least 60 pounds, and he was clearly expecting her to be intimidated. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes with the calm, measuring gaze she had perfected during countless dangerous situations overseas. "I wouldn't recommend that," she said quietly. Rodriguez blinked, momentarily unsettled by her complete lack of fear. But his friends were watching, and backing down now would mean losing face in front of the group. "Oh, you wouldn't recommend it?" he said, his voice rising. "And what exactly are you going to do about it, lady? Call your lawyer?" Thompson stepped up beside his friend, and now Sarah was caught between the two of them. The other cadets had formed a loose circle around the confrontation, blocking any easy escape routes. Not that Sarah was planning to escape. "Maybe we should call security," Chen suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew that involving adults would mean explaining why they were harassing a lone woman on the training ground. "No need for security," Thompson said with a cruel smile. "I think we can handle one confused civilian." Sarah could see what was about to happen. Thompson and Rodriguez were positioning themselves to grab her, probably planning to physically escort her off the training ground. They thought they were dealing with a helpless woman who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. They had no idea that the helpless woman had completed some of the most grueling military training in the world. They didn't know that she had survived combat situations that would have broken most people. They couldn't imagine that the small mud-covered figure in front of them had skills that few people on Earth possessed. "Last chance," Thompson said, reaching out to grab Sarah's arm. "You can walk away from this, or we can make you walk away." His hand was inches from her shoulder when Sarah moved. It happened so fast that most of the cadets didn't even see it clearly. One moment Thompson was reaching for her, confident and aggressive. The next moment he was flat on his back in the mud, gasping for air and trying to figure out what had just happened. Sarah hadn't hurt him, not really. She had simply used his own momentum against him, redirecting his grab into a perfectly executed throw that sent him sprawling. It was a basic self-defense technique, the kind of thing she could do in her sleep, but to the cadets it looked like magic. Rodriguez stepped back immediately, his eyes wide with shock. The other cadets stood frozen, their mouths hanging open as they stared at Thompson lying in the mud like a landed fish. "What the hell?" Williams whispered. Thompson struggled to his feet, his perfect uniform now caked with mud and grass stains. His face was red with embarrassment and fury. He looked around at his friends, seeing the shock and confusion in their eyes, and Sarah could practically watch his humiliation transform into rage. "You crazy witch," he shouted, advancing on Sarah again. "I'm going to make you pay for that." But this time Sarah was ready for him. When he lunged at her, she didn't just defend herself. She demonstrated exactly why messing with her was a very bad idea. The second takedown was even more spectacular than the first. Thompson hit the ground even harder the second time, and this time he stayed down for several long seconds. When he finally rolled over and looked up at Sarah, there was something different in his eyes. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a mixture of pain, confusion, and the first hint of real fear. Sarah stood over him, completely calm and controlled. She wasn't even breathing hard. To the watching cadets, it was as if she had barely exerted herself while effortlessly handling someone twice her size. "Stay down," Sarah said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Thompson's hands freeze halfway to pushing himself up. Rodriguez had backed away several more steps. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. Williams and Chen were looking at each other with wide eyes, clearly trying to process what they had just witnessed. The other two cadets were edging toward the path that led back to the dormitory, apparently considering whether they should run for help. "What are you?" Williams whispered. Sarah looked around the circle of shocked faces. These boys had gone from mocking her to fearing her in the space of 30 seconds, and she could see that their entire worldview was being challenged. They had been so certain of their superiority, so convinced that they knew exactly who she was and what she represented. "I told you," Sarah said simply. "I'm military." Thompson was finally climbing to his feet again, moving much more carefully this time. His uniform was completely ruined, covered in mud from head to toe. But more importantly, his dignity was in tatters. In front of his friends, in front of the cadets who looked up to him as their leader. He had been humiliated by someone he had dismissed as a harmless civilian. That's impossible, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Women aren't allowed in combat roles. Everyone knows that. Sarah almost smiled at his ignorance. The ban on women in combat had been lifted years ago, and there were female soldiers serving in some of the most dangerous and elite units in the military. But she could see that these cadets were living in a bubble, surrounded by outdated ideas about what women could and couldn't do. You might want to update your information, she said mildly. Rodriguez was shaking his head in denial.
No way. Even if women are in the military now, they're not in the real combat units.
Their support staff, medics, maybe pilots. They don't do the actual fighting. The comment revealed so much about how these young men viewed the world. They had been raised to believe that physical strength was the only thing that mattered in combat, that bigger automatically meant better. They had no understanding of the mental toughness, tactical intelligence, and specialized skills that modern warfare required. Sarah could have told them about the female soldiers she had served with, women who had earned their places in some of the most elite units in the military through sheer determination and skill. She could have explained how physical strength was just one small component of what made an effective soldier, but she knew they wouldn't believe her. Not yet. Chen was staring at her with a different kind of expression now, as if he was starting to piece together a puzzle. Wait a minute, he said slowly. You said your name was Sarah Martinez. Are you here for a job interview or something? Sarah nodded. Something like that. Williams laughed nervously. What kind of job? Janitor, food service? But Chen was thinking harder than his friends, and Sarah could see understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. No, he said quietly. She's not here for that kind of job. Thompson was getting angry again, his humiliation fueling a need to reassert his dominance. I don't care what kind of job she's here for, he snarled. She assaulted a cadet. That's a serious offense. We need to report this immediately. Report what exactly? Sarah asked. That you attacked a woman and she defended herself. We didn't attack you, Rodriguez protested. We were just trying to remove a trespasser from Academy property. By grabbing me without permission? The cadets exchanged uncertain glances. They were starting to realize that their version of events might not sound as heroic as they had initially thought. If this incident was reported to Academy officials, they would have to explain why 6 male cadets had cornered a lone woman and attempted to physically remove her from the training ground. Look, Chen said, clearly trying to defuse the situation. Maybe we all got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we just go our separate ways and forget this whole thing happened? But Thompson wasn't ready to let it go. His pride had been wounded, and he needed to salvage something from this encounter. No way, he said firmly. She can't just assault cadets and walk away. There have to be consequences. Sarah studied his face and saw something that concerned her. Thompson wasn't just angry or embarrassed, he was desperate. She realized that his status among the other cadets was probably built on his reputation as the tough guy, the leader who could handle any situation. Having that image shattered in front of his peers was more than just humiliating. It was threatening to his entire identity. What consequences did you have in mind? Sarah asked carefully. Thompson's eyes narrowed. I think you need to learn some respect. And I think my friends and I are just the people to teach it to you. The threat was clear, and Sarah could see the other cadets shifting uncomfortably. They were followers, not leaders, and they would go along with whatever Thompson decided to do. But she could also see that some of them were having second thoughts about the wisdom of continuing this confrontation. Rodriguez looked uncertain. Maybe we should just— Shut up, Thompson snapped. This isn't over. He was advancing on Sarah again, but this time he was more cautious, keeping his hands up in a defensive position. He had learned from his earlier mistakes and was approaching her like the potential threat she obviously was. Sarah sighed. She had hoped to avoid further escalation, but Thompson was clearly not going to back down until he felt like he had restored his damaged reputation, and unfortunately for him that was never going to happen through violence. You really don't want to do this, she warned him. Yeah, Thompson said, feinting left and then lunging right. Let's see how tough you really are. What happened next would be talked about in whispers around the academy for years to come. In the space of 15 seconds, Sarah neutralized not just Thompson but Rodriguez and Williams as well, when they jumped in to help their friend. She moved like water. flowing around their clumsy attacks and using their own aggression against them. When the dust settled, 3 cadets were on the ground and the other 3 were backing away with their hands raised in surrender. And that was when Commandant Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived on the scene, attracted by the shouting and commotion. She took one look at the mud-covered woman standing calmly among the fallen cadets and knew exactly who she was looking at. "Ms. Martinez, I presume?" she said with a slight smile. Colonel Hayes was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of bearing that came from 30 years of military service. She wore her dress uniform with crisp precision, and her sharp eyes took in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had dealt with countless disciplinary situations over the years. The cadets scrambled to their feet as quickly as they could, their faces pale with the realization that they had been caught in a compromising situation by the Academy's highest-ranking officer. Thompson tried to brush the mud off his uniform, but he only succeeded in smearing it around further. "Colonel Hayes, ma'am," Thompson said, snapping to attention despite his disheveled appearance. "We found this woman trespassing on Academy grounds and you decided to handle the situation yourselves rather than contacting security," Colonel Hayes finished for him, her voice carrying a note of disapproval that made all 6 cadets wince. "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am. Thompson's confidence had completely deserted him in the presence of actual authority. Colonel Hayes turned her attention to Sarah, who stood quietly with her hands at her sides, looking completely unruffled despite having just taken down 3 opponents in rapid succession. "Ms. Martinez," the colonel said with a slight nod of respect, "I wasn't expecting to meet you until our scheduled appointment this morning, but I have to say, this is quite an introduction." The cadets looked back and forth between the 2 women, confusion written clearly on their faces. Chen was the first to speak up. "Ma'am, you know this woman?" "Indeed I do, Cadet Chen," Colonel Hayes replied. "Allow me to introduce Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, recently retired from the United States Navy. She's here to take over as our new senior physical training instructor." The words hit the cadets like a physical blow. Thompson's mouth fell open, and Rodriguez actually took a step backward as if he had been pushed. Williams made a small choking sound, and the other 3 cadets just stared in stunned silence. "Master Chief?" Williams whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's correct," Colonel Hayes confirmed. "Master Chief Martinez served with distinction for 15 years, including multiple combat deployments and specialized assignments that I'm sure she'll tell you about when she sees fit." Sarah could see the cadets' minds racing as they tried to process this information. Master Chief was one of the highest enlisted ranks in the Navy, a position that required not just exceptional skill, but also proven leadership under the most challenging circumstances. Thompson was shaking his head in denial. But she's a woman, and she's so small." Colonel Hayes's expression hardened. "Cadet Thompson, are you suggesting that a person's gender or physical size determines their military capability?" "No, ma'am, that's not what I meant." "Because if that's what you're suggesting," the colonel continued, "then you clearly haven't been paying attention in your military history classes. Some of our most effective warriors throughout history have been people who didn't fit the traditional image of what a soldier should look like." Rodriguez was staring at Sarah with something approaching awe. "Master Chief, what was your specialty in the Navy?" Sarah looked at Colonel Hayes, who nodded encouragingly. "Special operations," Sarah said simply. The 2 words landed like grenades among the cadets. Special operations meant elite units, the kind of highly trained soldiers they had only read about in books or seen in movies. These were the people who undertook the most dangerous missions, who operated behind enemy lines and accomplished objectives that regular military units couldn't handle. "Which unit?" Chen asked, his voice hushed with respect. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Her service record was classified at the highest levels, and there were aspects of her career that she would never be able to discuss openly. But there was one piece of information that she could share, and she knew it would have the maximum impact on these young men who had so thoroughly underestimated her. "SEAL Team 6, she said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. SEAL Team 6 was legendary, the most elite special operations unit in the American military. These were the people who undertook the most dangerous and sensitive missions in the world. The soldiers who operated in complete secrecy and whose very existence was rarely acknowledged by the government. Thompson's legs seemed to give out, and he sat down heavily on a nearby bench. "Oh my God," he whispered. Oh my God." Colonel Hayes watched the cadets' reactions with satisfaction. Master Chief Martinez was one of the first women to complete SEAL training successfully, she explained. She served on multiple classified operations and was decorated for valor under fire on several occasions. Williams was hyperventilating. "We attacked a Navy SEAL," he said to no one in particular. "We actually attacked a Navy SEAL." Rodriguez buried his face in his hands. "My dad is going to kill me. He's going to literally kill me." Sarah could see that the cadets were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake, but she also recognized that they were young and had been operating under false assumptions that had been reinforced by a lifetime of societal conditioning. This was a teaching moment, not just a disciplinary one. "Cadets," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Look at me." 6 pairs of eyes snapped to attention, focusing on her with the kind of intense concentration that only came from realizing they were in the presence of someone truly exceptional. "What happened here today was a failure of intelligence gathering," Sarah continued. "You made assumptions based on incomplete information, and you acted on those assumptions without attempting to verify them. In a combat situation, that kind of mistake can get people killed." Thompson nodded miserably. "Yes, Master Chief." "But more importantly," Sarah said, "you allowed your preconceptions about gender and physical appearance to cloud your judgment. You decided that because I was a woman and because I was smaller than you, I couldn't possibly pose a threat or have anything valuable to contribute." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "In the real military, you'll serve alongside people of all backgrounds, genders, and physical types. Some of the most effective soldiers I've known were people who didn't look like traditional warriors. If you can't learn to see past surface appearances and recognize competence wherever it comes from, you'll never be effective leaders." Colonel Hayes stepped forward. "Master Chief Martinez will be taking over all physical training programs at the Academy starting Monday morning. I suggest you use the weekend to reflect on what happened here today and to prepare yourselves for a significantly more challenging training regimen than what you've experienced so far." The cadets were all nodding enthusiastically, their earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine respect and more than a little fear. "Master Chief," Chen said hesitantly, Will you be training us personally?" Sarah looked at the young man who had shown more intelligence and less aggression than his peers. "All cadets will participate in the new training program. Cadet Chen, I believe you'll find it quite educational." Thompson struggled to his feet, his uniform still caked with mud but his posture now rigidly correct. "Master Chief, I owe you an apology. We all do." "Our behavior was inexcusable." Sarah studied his face and saw genuine remorse there, along with the beginning of real understanding. These boys had learned something important today, and she was curious to see whether the lesson would stick. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made perfect conditions for physical training. Sarah stood at the edge of the obstacle course at 5:30 in the morning, wearing her new academy instructor uniform and watching as 48 cadets assembled in formation before her. Word had spread quickly through the academy about Saturday's incident. The 6 cadets involved had told their friends who had told their friends, and by Sunday evening every student on campus knew that their new PT instructor was not just any former soldier, but a Navy SEAL who had single-handedly taken down 3 of their classmates. The story had grown in the telling, as stories often do. Some versions had Sarah defeating a dozen cadets. Others claimed she had thrown Thompson so hard he landed in the next county. But the core truth remained the same. The small woman standing before them was someone who commanded serious respect. Sarah could see the mixture of emotions on the cadets' faces as they stood at attention. There was curiosity, certainly, and more than a little apprehension. But there was also something she hadn't expected: genuine excitement. These young people had joined a military academy because they wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. And now they were being trained by someone who represented the absolute pinnacle of military achievement. Thompson stood in the front row, his posture perfect and his expression focused. The arrogance that had defined him on Saturday was completely gone, replaced by the kind of intense attention that Sarah recognized in soldiers who had learned important lessons the hard way. "Good morning, cadets," Sarah said, her voice carrying easily across the formation without needing to be raised. "Good morning."
"Master Chief Martinez!"
came the thunderous reply from 48 voices in unison. Sarah had spent Sunday evening reviewing the Academy's current physical training program, and she had been unimpressed. The routines were outdated, focused more on building muscle mass than developing the kind of functional fitness that modern military personnel actually needed. There was too much emphasis on individual achievement and not enough on teamwork and problem-solving under pressure. "For the next semester, we're going to be making some changes to your physical training regimen," Sarah announced. "Some of you may find these changes challenging. Others may find them impossible. But I guarantee that if you commit yourself fully to this program, you will emerge as better soldiers and better leaders than you thought possible." Rodriguez raised his hand tentatively. "Master Chief, what kind of changes are we talking about?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I'm glad you asked, Cadet Rodriguez. Rather than tell you, I think it would be more instructive to show you. Everyone drop and give me 50 push-ups." The cadets immediately dropped to the ground and began their push-ups. Sarah walked among them, observing their form and noting which ones were struggling. The Academy's previous training had clearly emphasized quantity over quality. Many of the cadets were doing rapid, shallow push-ups that engaged only a fraction of the muscle groups they should have been working. "Stop," Sarah called out after most of them had completed about 30 repetitions. "Cadet Williams, demonstrate the push-up technique you were just using." Williams, red-faced and breathing hard, demonstrated his rapid-fire style. His back was arched, his arms barely bent, and his movement was so quick that he was essentially bouncing off the ground, rather than controlling his descent and ascent. "Thank you, Cadet Williams. Now watch carefully as I demonstrate the proper technique for a military push-up." Sarah dropped to the ground and performed 5 perfect push-ups, her body moving in a controlled, precise manner that engaged her core, chest, shoulders, and arms equally. Each repetition took about 3 seconds to complete, and her form never wavered. "The difference," she explained as she stood up, "is that Cadet Williams was trying to complete as many repetitions as possible as quickly as possible. I was focused on maximizing the effectiveness of each individual repetition. In combat, you don't get points for doing things fast if you do them wrong." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "So quality over quantity?" "Exactly. Now everyone back down. We're going to do this again, but this time I want you to focus on perfect form. I'd rather see you complete 10 perfect push-ups than 50 sloppy ones." As the cadets began their corrected push-ups, Sarah could already see improvement. They were moving more slowly, but their muscles were working harder and their technique was better. Several of them were struggling to complete even 10 repetitions with proper form, which told her everything she needed to know about the effectiveness of their previous training. "Excellent," she said as they finished. "Now we're going to move to the obstacle course. But we're not going to run it individually. You're going to complete it as teams." She divided the 48 cadets into 8 teams of 6, mixing up the groups so that the natural cliques and hierarchies were disrupted. Thompson found himself grouped with Chen, Williams, and 3 other cadets he didn't normally associate with. "Each team will navigate the obstacle course together," Sarah explained. "No one crosses the finish line until everyone on your team crosses the finish line. If one person fails an obstacle, the entire team repeats that obstacle until everyone succeeds." The cadets exchanged glances. This was completely different from their previous training, where individual achievement was everything and helping your classmates was often seen as weakness. "Master Chief," one of the cadets called out, "what if someone on our team just can't complete an obstacle?" "Then you find a way to help them complete it," Sarah replied simply. "In real military operations, you don't leave people behind because they're not as fast or as strong as you are. You find solutions." She pointed to the first obstacle, a 8-foot wall that had to be climbed with a rope. "For example, if someone on your team can't climb the rope, maybe 2 people boost them up while a 3rd person pulls from the top. The goal isn't to prove individual superiority. It's to accomplish the mission as a unit." Thompson looked at his teammates with new eyes. Williams was clearly the weakest member of their group, struggling with upper body strength. In the old system, Thompson would have completed the course as quickly as possible and left Williams to fail on his own. Now Williams' success was directly tied to his own. "Teams 1 and 2, you're up first," Sarah announced. "Everyone else, watch and learn." The first two teams approached the wall obstacle with the kind of tentative coordination that marked groups of people who weren't used to working together. Team 1 reached the wall first and immediately began attempting individual climbs with predictable results. 3 members made it over quickly, but the other 3 struggled with the rope climb. Team 2, led by Chen, took a different approach. They spent 30 seconds discussing strategy before anyone attempted the obstacle. When they reached the wall, they immediately began boosting their weaker climbers while their strongest members positioned themselves at the top to pull people up. The difference in results was dramatic. Team 2 completed the obstacle in half the time it took Team 1, despite having what appeared to be less individual talent. "Excellent work, Team 2, Sarah called out. "Team 1, what did you observe about Team 2's approach that was different from yours?" Thompson, who was on Team 1, spoke up. "They worked together from the beginning instead of trying individual climbs first." "And what was the result of that cooperation?" "They were faster and more efficient than we were," Sarah nodded. "Remember that lesson, because it applies to every obstacle on this course and every challenge you'll face in your military careers." As the morning progressed, Sarah watched the cadets begin to internalize the lessons she was teaching. Teams started communicating better. Stronger members began automatically helping weaker ones, and the focus shifted from individual glory to collective success. By the end of the 2-hour session, the transformation was remarkable. The same cadets who had started the morning as individuals competing against each other had evolved into functioning teams that looked out for one another. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she had first encountered the 6 cadets who had tried to humiliate her. The training ground looked the same, but everything else had changed dramatically. The cadets who assembled before her each morning were transformed. They moved with confidence and precision, worked together seamlessly, and carried themselves with the bearing of real soldiers rather than privileged teenagers, playing at being military officers. Thompson jogged up to her, barely breathing hard despite having just completed a 5-mile run in full gear. "Master Chief, Team Alpha is ready for the final assessment," he reported. Sarah nodded and checked her watch. The final assessment was something she had designed specifically for these cadets. A comprehensive test that would challenge everything they had learned over the past 3 months. It combined physical obstacles, problem-solving under pressure, and leadership rotation in a scenario that simulated real combat conditions. "Gather the other teams." Cadet Captain Thompson. The promotion had been announced the previous week. Thompson's natural leadership abilities, once channeled properly, had made him an obvious choice for cadet captain. But more importantly, he had learned to lead through example and support rather than intimidation and arrogance. As the 8 teams assembled, Sarah could see the bonds that had formed between cadets who had barely known each other's names 3 months ago. Rodriguez and Williams, once antagonists, now worked together so smoothly. They seemed to read each other's minds. Chen had emerged as a tactical thinker whose quiet intelligence complemented Thompson's more aggressive leadership style. "Today's assessment will test everything you've learned," Sarah announced. "You'll face 12 different challenges over the course of 4 hours. Some will test your physical abilities, others your mental toughness, and all of them will require teamwork and leadership." She paused, looking at each face in turn. "But more than that, this assessment will reveal who you've become over these past 3 months." The cadets who started this program were individuals focused on personal achievement. The soldiers finishing it should be leaders focused on mission, accomplishment, and team success. The first challenge was a modified obstacle course that required teams to transport a wounded teammate through a series of barriers while under simulated enemy fire. Sarah watched as Team Alpha, led by Thompson, immediately formed a protective formation around their designated casualty and began moving with the kind of tactical awareness she had drilled into them. Rodriguez's team chose a different approach, using speed and deception to avoid the enemy fire zones entirely. Both strategies were valid, and both demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking that real military leaders needed. The second challenge tested their ability to work under extreme stress. Each team was given a complex puzzle that could only be solved through coordination between all 6 members, but they had to complete it while performing physical exercises that left them exhausted and mentally drained. Sarah watched Williams struggle with his portion of the puzzle, his hands shaking from fatigue as he tried to manipulate the small pieces. 3 months ago, his teammates would have either ignored his struggle or worse, taken over his portion out of impatience. Instead, Chen quietly moved to support Williams's arms while Rodriguez provided verbal guidance, allowing Williams to complete his section successfully. Challenge after challenge revealed the depth of transformation these young people had undergone. They had learned to lead from any position, to adapt their strategies based on changing circumstances, and to prioritize mission success over personal glory. But it was the final challenge that truly demonstrated how far they had come. Sarah had designed it as a leadership rotation exercise where each team member had to take command for 10 minutes, while the others deliberately created obstacles and distractions. It was meant to test their ability to maintain focus and authority under pressure. Thompson was leading his team through a complex navigation exercise when Williams deliberately dropped an essential piece of equipment into a mud pit. 3 months ago, Thompson would have exploded in anger and probably dismissed Williams from the exercise entirely. Instead, he calmly assessed the situation and adapted his plan. Rodriguez, Chen, continue with the navigation. Williams, you're with me. We're going to retrieve that equipment together. As they worked to fish the gear out of the mud, Thompson looked at Williams seriously. I know you dropped that on purpose, he said quietly. And I know why. You're testing whether I'll abandon a team member when things get difficult. Williams nodded, impressed despite himself. So what's your answer? My answer is that good leaders don't abandon their people, even when those people make mistakes. Especially when they make mistakes. It was exactly the right response, and Sarah felt a surge of pride as she watched the interaction. This was the same young man who had tried to physically intimidate her 3 months ago, convinced that his size and aggression made him a natural leader. Now he understood that real leadership was about service, not dominance. As the assessment concluded, Sarah gathered all 48 cadets in a formation. They stood at attention, but she could see the quiet confidence in their bearing. They knew they had performed well, but more importantly, they had performed as a unit. 3 months ago, Sarah began, I met 6 cadets on this training ground who thought they knew what military service was about. They thought it was about individual strength, about proving dominance, about maintaining hierarchy through intimidation. She looked directly at Thompson, Rodriguez, Williams, and the others who had been part of that first encounter. Those cadets learned that real military service is about something entirely different. It's about collective strength, about proving reliability, about building others up, rather than tearing them down. Thompson stepped forward. Master Chief, on behalf of all the cadets, I want to thank you for teaching us what it really means to be soldiers. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but she held up a hand to indicate she wasn't finished. The most important lesson you've learned isn't about physical fitness or tactical skills. It's about recognizing capability and potential in people who might not look like your idea of a warrior. She gestured toward the group as a whole. Every person in this formation has strengths that others lack. Some of you are natural athletes, others are strategic thinkers, others are natural motivators. The magic happens when you learn to combine those different strengths into something greater than the sum of its parts. Rodriguez spoke up. Master Chief, will you be staying on at the academy permanently? Sarah smiled. I'll be here for another year, training the next class of cadets. After that, we'll see. What she didn't tell them was that she had already received 3 job offers from other military academies who had heard about her innovative training methods. Word was spreading through military education circles about the remarkable results she had achieved with cadets who had previously been considered problematic. The cadets dispersed to clean their equipment and prepare for the evening meal. Thompson lingered behind. Master Chief, he said hesitantly, I need to ask you something. Sarah waited patiently. That first day when I tried to intimidate you, did you know immediately that you could handle all of us? Sarah considered the question carefully. I knew I could defend myself if necessary, she said finally. But more importantly, I could see that underneath all the bluster and aggression you were young people who wanted to be part of something meaningful. You just needed someone to show you what that actually looked like. Thompson nodded slowly. You saw potential in us even when we were acting like idiots. Everyone has potential, Cadet Captain. The question is whether they're willing to do the work necessary to realize it. As Thompson jogged away to catch up with his teammates, Sarah reflected on her own journey to this moment. She had spent 15 years serving her country in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. But these 3 months of teaching might have been the most important work she had ever done. She had taken a group of privileged, arrogant teenagers and transformed them into the kind of leaders the military desperately needed. People who understood that true strength came from lifting others up, not putting them down. And it had all started with 6 young men who thought they knew everything about military service, only to discover they knew nothing at all. The mud-covered woman they had mocked and tried to intimidate had taught them the most valuable lesson of their lives. Never judge a book by its cover, because you never know when that book might be written by a Navy SEAL.